J.D. Vance goes undercover in a factory. The shocking ending will blow your mind. Vice President J.D. Vance sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The weight of the world rested heavily on his shoulders. As the country's second highest leader, he was often in meetings, making decisions and delivering speeches, but something felt missing. He couldn't help but think back to his childhood in the hills of Appalachia, how life had been simpler. Then, though no less hard, in those days, he had learned the value of a good day's work, of putting in hours and hours to earn a modest living. He had seen the resilience of the people around him, the farmers, the miners, the small business owners, those whose lives were rooted in the soil of their communities. Yet somewhere along the way, the connection between public figures and the everyday person had been severed. People in Washington, Vance thought, no longer understood what it meant to struggle, to live paycheck to paycheck, to wonder how the bills would get paid at the end of the month. There was a disconnect, a huge one, and Vance was beginning to realize that he was no exception. He had made it out of the hollows of Kentucky, gone on to study at Yale, and eventually risen to a prominent position in American politics. But as he thought about the people who had supported him on his journey, his family, his community, he began to wonder if he truly understood their lives. Did he really know what it was like to be one of the people he now represented? To live without the security of a powerful office? To face struggles that felt insurmountable? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling him in ways he hadn't expected. As a leader, he had always prided himself on being empathetic, on understanding the challenges faced by working-class Americans. But now, staring at his reflection in the window, he wondered if empathy was enough. Could understanding really come from a distance, from the comfort of a high office, or did it require something deeper, something more personal? He mulled over these questions for days, trying to find an answer, and then it hit him. What if he could experience life as others did? What if, for just a brief moment, he could walk in the shoes of someone who struggled to make ends meet? What if he could see the world through their eyes, feel their fears, their frustrations, their hopes? A decision formed in his mind. He would go undercover. He would become one of them. The plan would be risky, but Vance had always believed in taking bold steps. With the help of a small team, he would disappear from the public eye, adopting a completely new identity. He would pose as Joe, a factory worker, or perhaps a service industry worker, in a small town in the Midwest, far away from the bustle of Washington. There, he would experience the life of someone working for minimum wage, someone whose days were long and whose dreams were often dashed by circumstance. It wasn't just about the experiment itself. It was about truly understanding. Vance needed to hear the stories of the people who lived with hardship every day. He needed to see how they interacted with the world, what challenges they faced, and how they coped with a system that often seemed stacked against them. It was one thing to hear their voices in a campaign speech, but it was another thing entirely to walk beside them, to share their daily battles. Vance stood up from his desk, pacing the room as he thought about the journey. Ahead, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This wasn't just an exercise in empathy, it was a chance for real growth, for real change. His actions could demonstrate that leaders didn't have to remain distant from the people they served, that they could meet them where they were and see the world as they saw it. But there was more at play here. A part of him feared the exposure. What would the public think if they learned that their vice president had gone undercover as a factory worker? Would he be seen as a fraud? Would his authenticity be called into question? Or perhaps more deeply, would the experiment reveal something about him that he didn't want to see? As he prepared for the undercover mission, Vance had to confront his own doubts and fears. The decision wasn't easy, and he knew it would require a great deal of humility. The idea of living as Joe in a small town wasn't just a political stunt. It was an opportunity to learn about himself, to reflect on his past, and to gain a deeper understanding of the American people. With a final look at the office, around him, Vance reached for his phone. He would begin making arrangements, securing the resources he needed to make this mission a reality. He was about to embark on a journey that would change everything for him, for his career, for the people he aimed to serve, and perhaps, in the end, for the country itself. Vance arrived in the small Midwestern town under the cover of darkness, the cool air carrying the scent of fresh grass and asphalt. He was greeted by his team, a group of trusted individuals who had helped him meticulously plan every detail of the experiment. There was no turning back now. They drove him to a modest motel on the outskirts of town, where he would stay for the next few weeks. The small, unassuming room lacked any trace of luxury. A simple bed, a faded dresser, and a television that hadn't been updated in years. It was everything he expected. Humble, plain. As he looked around, Vance felt an unexpected rush of anticipation. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like someone who held power. He felt like a man who had just walked off the streets, trying to make a living in a world that often felt indifferent to his existence. The next morning, dressed in worn, faded clothes and carrying only a duffel bag, he was ready. His new identity was simple: Joe, a name that held no significance, no power, and no expectations. A blank slate. He walked into the factory, his place of employment for the duration of the experiment, with his heart pounding in his chest. The building was loud, filled with the hum of machinery and the clatter of workers performing repetitive tasks. The air smelled of metal, oil, and dust. Vance could already feel the tension building. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who worked here. A woman behind the front desk gave him a quick, skeptical glance as he approached. "You're the new guy, right?" she asked with a thick Midwestern accent. Her tone was neutral, but there was an edge of curiosity. Vance nodded. "Yeah, just here to work." "Well, you'll fit in fine. We all do," she said, handing him a safety vest. "Take this and follow me." The woman, whose name turned out to be Cindy, led him into the factory floor. The workers barely noticed him as they continued with their tasks, heads down and focused on the machines in front of them. It wasn't long before Vance realized that blending in wouldn't be as easy as he had hoped. He was assigned to a station, surrounded by a group of workers assembling parts for an industrial machine. There was a palpable sense of fatigue in the air. The room was hot, the work monotonous, and the hours long. He moved clumsily at first, fumbling with the tools and equipment, which only drew a few knowing smirks from his co-workers. "Don't worry," a man beside him said. "You'll get the hang of it. Just don't mess up too much. We're on a tight schedule today." Vance forced a smile, nodding. He could feel the weight of their skepticism. They didn't know him, and they didn't trust him. He was an outsider pretending to fit in. As the hours dragged on, the work grew harder, and Vance's muscles began to ache. The room seemed to close in on him with each passing minute. His hands were rough and raw, his mind spinning as he tried to keep up with the pace. The factory workers moved like clockwork, seemingly impervious to the physical and mental toll the work took on them. One of his co-workers, a woman named Lisa, noticed his struggle and tossed him a bottle of water from across the station. "You all right there, Joe?" she asked with genuine concern. "Yeah, just not used to this," Vance admitted, feeling a bit embarrassed. Lisa chuckled softly. "Don't worry, it gets easier. Just gotta keep moving. You'll build up the muscles for it." Vance appreciated her kindness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. They knew he was new, and he could feel the unspoken judgment in their eyes. He wasn't one of them, not yet. Lunchtime came, and the workers gathered around a long, worn-out table in the break room. The conversation was light, but Vance felt the undercurrent of tension. He sat in silence, watching the others chat as if they had all known each other for years. The noise from the factory floor seemed to fade away as he focused on the conversations happening around him. One of his co-workers, a man named Tom, leaned over and gave him a half-smile. "You don't talk much, do you?" Vance shrugged. "Just getting to know the place." Tom laughed softly. "Well, you'll get to know a lot more than you think. Stick around long enough and you'll see how the real world works around here." There was a hint of something deeper in his words, something Vance couldn't quite put his finger on. It was a reminder that these people had their own stories, their own struggles, and they weren't eager to share them with just anyone, not even someone who claimed to be one of them. The shift ended later that evening, and Vance left the factory feeling physically exhausted, but also mentally drained. The workers had gone through their routines with a kind of quiet resilience, but he could tell that not all of them were content. Some had resigned themselves to the grind, while others had lost hope, their faces worn from years of hard labor. Vance lay in bed that night, replaying the day in his mind. He couldn't help but feel that the hardest part of the experiment was still ahead of him. He had barely scratched the surface of what these people went through, but he had already learned one thing. The challenges they faced were not just physical. There was something deeper, something intangible that set them apart from the world he knew, something that demanded more than just empathy. It demanded understanding. As he drifted off to sleep, Vance knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was committed to the journey, no matter where it led. The following days blurred together in a haze of repetitive tasks, sweat, and constant movement. Vance's muscles ached from the factory work, but it was the mental exhaustion that he found most difficult to endure. He had thought he understood the working class, had thought he could empathize with their struggles, but nothing had truly prepared him for the sheer weight of it all. At first, he kept his head down, focused solely on fitting in and learning the job. But as the days went by, small moments of kindness and cruelty began to emerge, offering him a window into the hearts and minds of his co-workers. One afternoon, as Vance struggled with an unfamiliar task, a machine part that just wouldn't fit properly, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Lisa, the woman who had offered him water on his first day. "You good?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm fine," Vance replied, trying to mask his frustration. "Just having a bit of trouble with this." Lisa didn't say anything at first. She simply took a step forward and adjusted the machine part with ease. "You're thinking too much about it. You just gotta get the rhythm right, like everything." Here, Vance watched her, taking in the grace with which she worked. She wasn't just skilled. She was a lifeline in this place, someone who seemed to hold the fragile fabric of the factory together. "Thanks," Vance said quietly, though the gratitude he felt was more than just for fixing the machine. He could see how much she cared about the work, how deeply invested she was in making things run smoothly. Later that day, during another lunch break in the cramped break room, a different co-worker caught his attention. Tom, the man who had offered him that cryptic remark about the real world, leaned over as Vance sat alone at the table, eating the meager lunch he had packed. "Hey, you okay?" Tom asked, his voice lower than usual. Vance looked up from his food, surprised. "Yeah, just tired. It's a lot to get used to." Tom's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "It's not just the work, though, is it? It's the people too, right? They're all just here, day in and day out, no time for anything else." Vance nodded slowly. "I guess. It's hard to imagine how they do it every day, the monotony." Tom snorted. "It's not just monotony, man, it's survival. That's all it is. You work, you survive, you go home, and then you get up and do it all over again. But don't forget, we're all in it together." Vance was taken aback by the sudden honesty in Tom's voice. It was raw, unfiltered, and spoke to something deeper than mere fatigue. This wasn't just about work, it was about life, about finding meaning in the routine, no matter how hard or pointless it might seem. The next day, a new challenge arose. Vance had been assigned to work with a different group of co-workers, and this time the atmosphere was colder, more distant. One of the men, a supervisor named Gary, eyed him with a combination of suspicion and disdain. Gary had a rough exterior, worn from years of dealing with difficult people and trying to keep the factory running smoothly. Vance tried his best to keep up, but Gary was quick to point out every mistake, no matter how small. "Come on, Joe. This is basic stuff. You really don't know how to do this?" Gary barked, his voice sharp. Vance felt his face flush. "I'm still learning. Just give me a minute." Gary's eyes narrowed. "You're just like the rest of them, huh? Can't think for yourself. You've got no work ethic. You don't belong here." The words stung, and for a moment, Vance felt himself slip. He wanted to lash out, to explain that he was doing this on purpose, that he wasn't like the other workers. But instead he bit his tongue and nodded, trying to force the words back down. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here to learn. As the days passed, the tension between Vance and Gary grew, but so did Vance's understanding of the dynamics in the factory. He began to see the cracks in the facade of hardened cynicism. Beneath the surface, there were layers of vulnerability, pain, and even a deep-seated hope that someday things could be different. One evening, after another exhausting day, Vance found himself sitting alone outside the factory. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the parking lot. He was lost in thought when he heard a familiar voice approach. It was Lisa again. "You're not inside with the others?" she asked, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. Vance shook his head. "Just needed a moment. To myself." Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I get it. It's a lot to take in. But don't forget, if you need help, you just ask. We're all in this together, even when it feels like we're not." Her words were simple, but they had weight. She was one of the few people in this factory who seemed to recognize that there was more to life than just getting through the day. She was someone who had seen the struggles and still chose to show up every day with kindness and resilience intact. That night, Vance lay awake in bed, his mind racing. He had come into this experiment with an idea of what he was going to find. A sense of unity, a connection that transcended differences. What he hadn't expected was how much he would learn about himself in the process. The next morning, he walked into the factory with a renewed sense of purpose. The exhaustion was still there, the constant pressure of trying to blend in with people who lived lives so different from his own. But there was something else now, too. A growing empathy, a deeper understanding of the people he had once considered to be so different from himself. Vance had spent his entire life climbing to a position of power, but it was in the humbling work of the factory, among people who had no interest in his name or his status, that he was beginning to find something much more valuable: humility. And with that, a new sense of connection was beginning to take root. The days had become a blur of grueling hours, aching muscles, and growing insight. Vance had found himself in a strange limbo, no longer the privileged vice president of the United States, but not entirely one of them either. His time in the factory had changed him, forced him to confront the harsh realities faced by working-class Americans, and yet there was an underlying tension that remained. His identity, a secret he'd kept from his co-workers, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the stress of pretending to be someone else. It was the deeper discomfort of not fully belonging. It had been 2 weeks since Vance had started his experiment as Joe, and each day had been an exhausting push and pull between his desire to connect and the growing need to reveal the truth. His relationships with his co-workers had deepened, particularly with Lisa, who had become a quiet anchor for him in this alien world. They shared lunches, exchanged small talk, and during break times, Lisa often spoke of her own dreams. Dreams of opening a small bakery or getting out of the factory life altogether. Vance had started to feel a kinship with her, and it made the lie more unbearable. It was on a particularly long shift, nearing the end of the second week, that everything came to a head. The factory had been running smoothly for the most part, and Vance was feeling more comfortable in his role as Joe, even joking around with some of the guys. But as the clock ticked toward the end of the shift, Vance felt a strange weight in the air. It was a community meeting that had been scheduled to address some of the issues the workers were facing. Disputes over overtime pay, concerns about equipment malfunctions, and talk of unionizing. The meeting room was packed, the air thick with the scent of coffee and worn leather. Workers gathered in clusters, murmuring among themselves. Vance stood at the back, trying to blend in, his heart pounding. His plan had been simple: stay anonymous, observe, learn. But the longer he stayed, the more the need to speak up gnawed at him. He had already seen how much his co-workers struggled, how much they endured for a paycheck, and yet they were often invisible to the world outside. That wasn't something he could ignore. As the meeting went on, the workers began to voice their frustrations. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a faded band t-shirt, spoke about the dangers of the machinery and how they weren't getting enough time for proper maintenance. A man in his 50s, who had been at the factory for more than 2 decades, shared his concerns about the mental toll the constant pressure was having on workers. Vance stood there listening, absorbing every word. But then Gary, the supervisor, who had made his life miserable in the early days, stood up. His expression was hard, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of contempt and arrogance. "Listen," Gary said, his voice gruff, "we're all working hard here, but no one is going to hand us anything. We need to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and get this place running, or we'll all be out of jobs." The room went silent. Gary's words were harsh, but they weren't exactly wrong. This was a battle for survival. The workers were fighting not just for better conditions, but for dignity and respect. Vance could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness of people who were used to being dismissed. And then, without thinking, Vance stood. The room fell, quiet as every eye turned toward him. His heart raced, his palms sweaty. He was about to do it. He was about to reveal who he really was. "Actually," Vance began, his voice trembling at first, "I know something about pulling yourself up, but I also know that some battles aren't about individual effort. Sometimes it's about people seeing you, hearing you, understanding what you're going through." He paused, trying to steady his breath. "My name is J.D. Vance, and I'm the Vice President of the United States." The silence in the room was deafening. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped. The workers exchanged confused looks, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Gary's mouth hung open in shock. Lisa, standing near the back, looked as if she had been punched in the stomach. Vance swallowed hard, continuing, "I'm here because I wanted to understand what life is really like for people who work in places like this, people who struggle to make ends meet every day. And what I've learned is that I had no idea. I thought I understood. I thought I was doing enough, but I was wrong." He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, some with skepticism, others with anger. He had broken the trust they had given him, the trust of a man they had thought was just another ordinary worker, someone they could talk to without judgment. "Everything I've seen in the last 2 weeks has opened my eyes," he continued. "The hardships, the sacrifices, the exhaustion, it's real, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the times I assumed that people like you could just pull yourselves up. I'm sorry for not listening." A murmur rippled through the room. Gary, still standing in the front, sneered. "So what? You think you can just waltz? In here and play at being one of us for a couple of weeks and then drop the "I'm the VP" bomb. You've got no idea what it's like to struggle like we do." Vance nodded, the bitterness in Gary's words stinging more than he expected. "You're right, I don't, and that's why I'm here. To listen, to learn. I'm not pretending to be one of you. I can never fully understand what it's like. But I promise you this, I will fight for policies that help people like you. I will fight for you. I will be your voice in a place where people like you are often forgotten." The room remained quiet, and for a long moment, no one said anything. Then, slowly, Lisa stepped forward, her expression soft but firm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're right. We don't need someone to pretend to be one of us. We need someone who sees us, who hears us." Gary, still visibly angry, turned and left the room, muttering under his breath. But the other workers began to murmur among themselves, some nodding, in agreement, others still uncertain, but all visibly moved by what Vance had said. As the meeting ended, Vance felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was out, and the weight of carrying it had lifted. But it wasn't just about revealing his identity. It was about what he had learned in the process. He had learned the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, of listening to their stories and struggles, and of showing up, not as a leader looking for solutions, but as someone who truly understood. As Vance walked out of the factory, that night he glanced back at the workers who were finishing their shifts, the hum of machines in the background. He knew that this moment, the revelation of his true self, was just the beginning of something much bigger. It was the beginning of change. A few weeks had passed since Vance's revelation at the factory, and the ripple effect of his undercover experiment was still being felt. The story of a high-profile political figure going undercover as a homeless worker had made headlines across the country, sparking debates and conversations about the struggles of the working class and the disconnection between politicians and everyday citizens. The public's response had been a mix of admiration, skepticism, and surprise, but the most important change was in the conversations it ignited within the communities he had visited. Vance's office had been flooded with messages from workers sharing their gratitude for his acknowledgement, to union leaders calling for deeper conversations about labor rights. But amid all the noise, there was one message that stood out the most, a letter from Lisa, the kind-hearted co-worker who had quietly become his ally in the factory. "Dear JD, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to thank you for something you may not even realize you did. You didn't just hear me, you saw me, all of us. After you left, things were different. People started talking more openly about what they were going through, and even Gary, well, he hasn't changed much, but he listened a little more. I think, for once, he realizes we're not asking for handouts. We're just asking to be seen. Your visit didn't fix everything, and I don't expect it to. But it gave us hope, and that's worth more than any policy or speech. I'm glad you came here. I'm glad you took the time to really understand. It may have been hard for you, but for us, it was everything. Thanks for everything. Sincerely, Lisa." Reading the letter in the quiet of his office, Vance felt a sense of closure wash over him. It wasn't about the national conversations or the media frenzy or even the political gains. It was about the people whose lives he had briefly stepped into and the way they had taught him something invaluable. The following week, Vance returned to the small town where it all began. He had spent months since the factory experiment advocating for better policies to address the needs of working-class Americans, but he knew that his personal journey wasn't complete without one final gesture. He had to go back. He walked into the factory as Joe once again, not disguised this time, but as himself. The workers were wrapping up their shifts, and the usual hum of machinery filled the air. They looked up in surprise as Vance entered, his presence unmistakable now, but there was no sense of discomfort. Instead, he was greeted with a mix of cautious curiosity and warm smiles. Lisa was the first to approach him. She extended a hand, and Vance took it, grateful for the unspoken understanding between them. "You came back," she said softly, as if confirming that he hadn't forgotten them. "I said I would," Vance replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I meant it." They walked through the factory floor together, speaking quietly. Vance listened as Lisa shared the latest struggles, the rising costs of healthcare, the ongoing fight for better wages. He nodded, not offering quick fixes or empty promises, but simply being there as he should have been all along. As they reached the break room, Vance turned to address the group of workers who had gathered there, their faces a mix of exhaustion and expectation. He cleared his throat, knowing that his words now carried a weight they hadn't before. "I want to thank you all," he began, his voice firm and genuine, "for showing me what it means to work hard and to fight for something better. I came here as a stranger, but I leave with a new perspective, one that will stay with me and one that will guide the work I do moving forward." There was a moment of silence, followed by a round of applause. Some workers exchanged glances, some even teared up, but all of them seemed to understand that this wasn't just another politician's empty speech. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Vance, but for them as well. "I'm not going to pretend that I know all the answers," he continued, "but I can promise you this. I will never forget the lessons you taught me, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you're heard, that you're seen." As he finished speaking, he turned to Lisa and the others who had gathered around. "Thank you for everything. I'll be carrying these lessons with me every day, and I hope that you know you matter. Your struggles, your dreams, your hard work, they matter." The next day, Vance returned to Washington, but he carried something with him that no policy document could replace, an understanding of the struggles that shaped so many of the people he represented. He gave interviews about his experiment, advocating for workers' rights and pushing for reforms that address the needs of everyday Americans. His message was clear. Empathy, not just policies, could bridge the divide between the halls of power and the factory floors. The story of his undercover experiment became a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful leaders must sometimes walk in the shoes of those they serve in order to truly understand their struggles. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there was still much work to be done. But Vance had learned one crucial truth. Real change begins when we listen, when we take the time to truly understand one another. In the end, it was a small gesture, one simple, honest conversation that sparked a larger movement. Vance's experiment, though unexpected, had become a catalyst for a nationwide discussion about empathy, dignity, and the need for a government that truly represented the people. And as the conversation grew, so did the understanding that one small act of kindness, one moment of genuine connection, could create a ripple effect capable of changing the world. And that, Vance knew, was only the beginning.